when I was about 7 years old, living part-time overseas in a small village in North Africa, in Algeria, we had a small handheld camcorder, which some of you might recognise, some maybe not. And I would follow it every time it was on, no matter what we were doing, whether we were olive picking, Eid celebrations, or even if we were just throwing out the rubbish. Sorry, I've already messed this up. There we go. Oh, okay. I'm back. Yeah, whatever we were doing, I would follow it around, and I was always there, front and centre in front of the camera, talking, or probably yapping is a better word. And I remember one day my mum, who's here, said to me that if you like speaking so much in front of the camera, you should become a journalist. And I was like, okay, I don't really know what that is, but I guess I'm going to be a journalist. Fast forward a few years, I was in high school here in Sydney, and my English teacher at the time, who I really respected, and English was my favourite subject, shout out to Zunaida, who was talking about that, told me that the best and the most powerful stories are the ones that are born through a purpose and that are told with a purpose. And I guess that's what we're going to focus on. So fast forward many years later, I am still yapping in front of a camera. Every day, I do think of that very message about purpose, because it's those stories that are born out of what the French call a raison d'être, that evokes that empathy and that inspires action, a deeper understanding of those really complex issues that we're faced with every day and that in turn shape our future. At the time, I didn't realise how deeply those words, stories with purpose, would guide me, and I didn't know that one day I'd be standing probably outside a crime scene of a burning house or a murder, talking to grieving families who had just lost everything and trying to find the right words that might do their stories justice. I didn't know how heavy stories could feel or how light they could make someone else feel just by knowing that someone was listening, that someone cared enough to share their grief with the rest of the world. When you think about the events that have shaped our world over the last few decades, some examples might be the Arab Spring, which happened in many countries that some of us here come from, Greta Thunberg, who pioneered climate change, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the story of Malala, which was mentioned a little bit earlier, and of course the current global events that are unfolding as we all sit in here in this room. So the Arab Spring began in Tunisia in 2010 with the story of Mohamed Bouazizi. He was 26 years old, he was a street vendor, working really hard, and obviously at the time there were several struggles that arguably were way worse than what we're facing today. On the 17th of December, he started work early and he was confronted by police. It was something that was happening all the time at that moment in time. His family say that his cart was confiscated and tossed over, he was humiliated and he was assaulted. So he went to the governor's office to complain and demand that his items be returned, but they refused to meet with him. So what he did was he went and acquired a can of gasoline from a nearby gas station. He went back to the governor's office, and less than an hour and a half after that first altercation with police, he stood outside the office in the middle of traffic and shouted, "How do you expect me to make a living in these conditions?" before he doused himself in the petrol and burnt himself. He suffered 90% burns and was taken to hospital, and he died several weeks later in January. But right after he had taken that risk, protests almost immediately broke out in his hometown, and they kept growing. Police attempted to stop the protests, but it only added fuel to that fire of the movement. And after he died, the protests became so prominent and they moved to the more affluent areas, to the capital, and eventually that anger became so intense that the president and his family had to flee in the same month that Mohammed died. The power of his story in feeling helpless against these corrupt governments, his courage to do something about it spread like wildfire and inspired millions right across the Arab world. And it led to similar movements in Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen. They too, similar to his story, were fueled by popular discontent with that authoritarian rule, the corruption, the economic hardship. And thanks to his courage and his story, they felt like they could take the risk in the name of meaningful change. Because in essence, they all shared the same struggle. So putting yourself in his shoes and I guess thinking a little bit about the world and the difficulties that we face today and the frustrations that he faced at the time, I don't know how many of us would have made the same risk. Not that I'm encouraging it either. The Arab Spring wasn't a perfect movement. It didn't solve every problem in the Middle East, obviously. In some instances, it actually made the situation far more volatile. But it did help in crack that regime and many regimes that were long thought to be invincible. And it showed that the power that regular people could hold in breaking down the iron walls of those systems, and that very power drove people into the streets in their millions. It redefined the political space in those societies, and it showed that protests and public demonstrations of public anger are no longer seen as signs of a challenge towards authorities, but the potential of forewarning of an uprising or even a revolution, which essentially is change. It also sparked, which many of us might not know, the role that social media played in documenting what was happening on the streets. Obviously something that we're seeing every day today, but it showed the first-hand accounts for the first time ever from the protesters themselves, particularly when the traditional media in these countries where censorship was rife and still is rife were attempting to play down those events. In 2018, shifting gears, Greta Thunberg skipped school to protest outside Swedish Parliament, demanding climate action. In April of 2019, she was 16 years old. She spoke in front of members of the European Parliament, telling them that they had failed as leaders because of their inaction in regards to climate change. 5 months later, she sailed by a yacht across the Atlantic to the UN to address a UN Climate Action Summit in New York, where she famously told the delegates that you've stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. She was then, post that, joined by tens of thousands of school and university students, not just in Sweden, but across more than a dozen countries in climate strikes that for the first time ever became a regular event. In March of that same year, a global strike drew the highest number ever at the time, which is more than 1 million people. And then in September of that year, that was quadrupled with the highest ever number of 4 million people. And I think today that has grown again, doubled, tripled, and quadrupled. So her story as a teenager inspired worldwide movement of student strikes. They were called Fridays for the Future, and it brought significant attention and public awareness to the issue of climate change. She didn't invent climate change. Everybody knew about it, and it certainly wasn't the first time it was being talked about. But it was her sacrifice that she made, her fearlessness, her deep commitment to the cause at 15 years old that made her story so prominent and so unique. And her courage and fearlessness, obviously, as we've seen today, has obviously gone beyond just climate action. Most recently, she was in the Freedom Flotilla. She boarded the Madeleine alongside several other activists attempting to bring symbolic aid to Gaza. Now, it was symbolic because Greta and I think all of the activists on that boat knew that they weren't going to solve the hunger strike in Gaza. It was more so for her, as she said in her own words, because she knew that this would make the world stop and talk about it. And it did. It brought mass attention to the famine, as well as her involvement in it, but also to the famine. So again, I ask, would you have taken that risk? Would you skip school? Again, not condoning it, but would you skip school to attend a protest? Maybe you would. George Floyd, who was killed at the hands of a police officer in Minneapolis in May of 2020. The Black Lives Matter movement existed long before him, but he took it And what happened to him made it take it to a whole new level. It triggered widespread protests, global conversation about systemic racism and police brutality. The video of his death, which was taken on a phone, which I might add, showed a white police officer kneeling on his neck for an extended period of time. He lost his breath and ultimately he died. It sparked outrage, understandably, and mass calls for justice, and it led to massive demonstrations in numerous cities across America. And it also brought back that conversation of America's long-standing crisis of racism in policing. Police brutality, racial discrimination, and violence against minorities are intertwined and rooted throughout America's history. The anger expressed in the wake of Floyd's killing reflects the reality that Black people in the US, even in 2020, and to be honest, even today, continue to be dehumanized, treated unjustly. But what was different this time around was that technology, a phone, meant that injustice could be documented and shared, and that's what made that movement so powerful, and that's why his story became so powerful. So much so it even spread internationally. It came here to Australia. It brought attention to the ongoing issue of Aboriginal deaths in custody, which is something that we continue to face today. Australians, in solidarity with that movement in America, organised protests here across major cities, in regional centres, to address these concerns. But I think what's important to note about that is those concerns have long existed for thousands of years, for as long as Aboriginal people have existed, and they used this spark or this model of hope to bring back that narrative and to bring it to the forefront. Another name you've already heard tonight is Malala. So I don't need to give you her background. She was shot in 2012 by the Taliban while she was on her way home from school. But I think something that we often forget or maybe don't realise is that her activism actually started with, not with speeches, but with a diary and her story. She was 11 years old. She began anonymously blogging for the BBC about life under Taliban rule in Pakistan. Her words, simple, observational, and childlike, but cut through the noise. And that's the thing about storytelling, is it doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes the most powerful stories whisper the truth. Malala's voice eventually sparked international outrage, then admiration, and ultimately a global education movement. And all of that started with her writing down her story. What about the untold stories from those who never had the courage or the means or even the platform to speak up? Those who were forced to take their stories to the grave. Stories that could have had the same impact as Greta or Malala or George or Mohamed, and that all of us in here will probably never know. Many could have even been stories from our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our ancestors. They probably belong to a time when speaking up could have killed you, a time which I should add still exists in some places here around the world. Or even if they did try to share their experience, it wasn't a time where it was easy to spread your story or to get the word out, as it is today. For example, a few years ago, I was at uni. By a few, it's not like two. I was also volunteering at Villawood Detention Centre at the time, and there I met a man called Massilia. So when I met him several years ago, had been in detention for 10 years at that point. He is what's called a stateless man, because he was found in an orphanage and he was moved around as a kid from country to country throughout his entire life. And in Australia, legislation states that if someone's country of origin can't be traced, then their eligibility for asylum can't actually be determined, and so you're detained indefinitely. You can't leave and you can't come out. Obviously, moved by his story, I wanted to try and get it out there and make sure as many people knew about it as well. So I started with a podcast for uni. Then about a year after that, I did an internship with Al Jazeera and I pitched to cover his story for them, and they did. And I talked about how his lawyers at the time were trying to do everything they could to bring his case to the High Court. A few months after that, he had a High Court date. So me and the other volunteers drove ourselves to Canberra to the High Court. I pitched the story to SBS that he'd made it to the High Court, and they agreed to cover it. He didn't actually win that day, but it was the first time in that decade that statelessness was brought back up in the High Court. And after that as well, his name was being covered everywhere. The ABC took it on, The Guardian took it on, and even the mainstreams took it on. Today, he is a free man and he's living here in Sydney. If we think about the means and how we share our stories today, you've got traditional media, TV, radio, print. You have digital media, websites and blogs, and arguably, or potentially not arguably, the most powerful, which is social media. TikTok, Insta, Facebook, Snapchat, which I hear is cool again. It's not hard for people to pick up your phone, record something, share it live, and for that thing to become viral. Sometimes in minutes, sometimes in hours, and sometimes in weeks. So I think it's important to recognise the privilege of that and the power that comes with that, and to make sure that we are using it for good, because it's something that I think we can all agree on probably is abused quite a lot nowadays. So I know, again, this was mentioned earlier, AI. A prime example is probably ChatGPT. In some cases, it is probably being used to tell stories, and it's an incredible tool. It helps you refine. Sometimes you don't know how to get the words out. You're like, oh yeah, that's the word I was thinking about. So it is really helpful in that sense. But something that I mentioned earlier, and that I was actually told when I first started, I guess, my career, is that the only thing that makes a story powerful and that makes a story great is the human element, is humanizing it. So if we think about the stories that we've talked about, Greta, Mohamed, George, Malala, they're all prime examples of that. Their stories were born out of their personal experiences and passions, and that's what made them powerful. And that's what made millions around the world resonate with them. The other thing that I think I'm going to bring up is responsibility. So obviously, with great access, like I mentioned, comes that great risk and that great responsibility. So, and again, I think about this every single time, is just because we can share something doesn't mean we always should. Are we telling these stories because we want to elevate these people's truths, or are we trying to just elevate ourselves? Are we telling someone else's pain with dignity, or do we think that people are going to tune in because it's actually really great content? As sad as that is, it is quite true. So at work, we call it harm minimalisation, and I think it's so important. I think lots more newsrooms should implement it, and that it should apply across all platforms, even if you're just posting something on your social media. Because if our stories, or if we want to tell stories that shape the future, then how we tell them also shapes the kind of future that we want to build. So, what can we take away from all of this? Why are you telling me this? All of these examples started as an event or an action, and that we've all seen before. Protesting out of Parliament is not groundbreaking. Discrimination and racism didn't happen in 2020. Corruption dates back centuries and centuries and centuries and thousands of years. It was what they went through that created that purpose element that so many could relate to, and that in turn brought that large scale attention to these movements in the media and in the public. That's how they came to be so powerful, and that's what helped shape the world that we live in today. I guess that brings us back to the now. So the media industry is what I like to call a juggernaut. It's kind of like its own individual world, and you don't need me to explain why. As much as it's had power to create meaningful change, it's also had the opposite effect. And I think obviously that's not more relevant than today. It's been used to promote personal agendas, political agendas. There's no denying that powerful leaders, political, public, use the media to enhance their objective. But despite all of their efforts, if you think about the stories that stick with you the most, or the stories that you resonate with the most, it's not those stories. Because nothing, again, has more powerful meaning than those human elements. The first-hand accounts, the raw visualizations of the impact that have been hard to ignore and that have stopped the narrative from being shaped by those powerful figures only. again, the world that we're living in today. I say all of this as a reminder to myself first, particularly what I'm about to say now, and I try to live by it every day. I think about it every day when I go to work. Our voices, not myself individually, but all together as a collectives, they matter. Even if we're in our little tiny corners of the world, they do matter. Even if they're the most harrowing story, you always find that little thread of hope, a smile, a gesture, a neighbour helping another. That's the kind of storytelling that we really do need to see more of nowadays. Not just the blind optimism, but that radical hope. The kind of hope that reminds us that changing is not only possible, but it's already happening. Every post, every article, every photo, every podcast, it's a brick in the building of the world that we want. So choose the stories that build the bridges and not the walls. Let's never underestimate the power of sharing our own stories or using our voices to tell the stories of others, even if it is just about olive picking or Eid in your own little village or in your own little corner of the world. So I'll leave you with this. What's the story you're not telling? I'm looking at all of you. The one that's buried in your journal or whispered that you only tell your friends at lunch or through a text message. What story shaped your worldview or could shape someone else's worldview? If they could shape someone else's worldview, and only if they heard it would it change something or spark something new or create that new movement that you know is so desperately needed. So don't wait for that right platform. Don't say you need to get more followers. The future is shaped by the stories we choose to tell now. So make them count, and don't wait for another Greta to change her story in the future when you can just do that on your own. Thank you.